My name is Adaeze Nwosu. I am 32 years old. 9 months ago, I was standing in the atrium of the Chicago Athletic Association Hotel, holding a glass of sparkling water I had been nursing for 40 minutes, surrounded by 200 people who had come to celebrate the launch of a business book called The Clarity Principle, written by my CEO, a man named Jonathan Price, who was at that exact moment standing at a podium in the center of the room, telling the audience that the book had emerged from 15 years of his leadership philosophy, refined through his experience building 3 companies, and distilled into a framework that he believed would change how executives thought about organizational decision-making. Every word of that book was mine, not the ideas. I want to be precise about that because precision is the thing I have learned to value above all else in the 2 years since this happened. The ideas were Jonathan's in the sense that they came from his mouth and his experience, and his 15 years of doing the work, and I had spent 8 months in rooms with him drawing them out, asking the questions that surfaced them, pressing on the places where he was vague until the vagueness resolved into something actual and specific. But the sentences were mine. The structure was mine. The framing was mine. The 312 pages that had been published 3 days earlier under Jonathan Price's name, and Jonathan Price's photograph, and Jonathan Price's biography, which described him as a sought-after speaker, advisor, and now author, had been written word by word at my desk in the spare bedroom of my apartment in Wicker Park between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. most evenings for 8 months, in the specific exhausted clarity that comes from working a full day at a demanding job and then coming home and doing a second job that you have agreed to do quietly and without recognition, and for a fee that you have only partly received. Before I tell you what happened in that atrium and what happened afterward, take a second to subscribe if this is the kind of story you want more of, and drop a comment with your city and the time there. I read every one. Let me tell you about Jonathan Price and about Price Group, and about the specific way I had come to be standing in a hotel atrium watching a man receive applause for work that had come out of my hands, because the launch party was not the beginning of this story. It was the point where the story I had been telling myself became impossible to maintain. Price Group was a management consulting firm that Jonathan had founded 11 years earlier, after a decade at 2 larger strategy consultancies where he had built a reputation for the particular kind of client work that gets called visionary in press profiles, and that more accurately consists of asking the right questions at the right time and being willing to follow the answers wherever they lead, which is rarer than it sounds. The firm had 12 employees when I joined at 28, after 3 years at a nonprofit doing communications and grant writing work that had paid for nothing, but had taught me that I was very good at translating complex ideas into clear language, which turned out to be a marketable skill in ways the nonprofit world had not fully compensated. I was hired as Jonathan's executive communications director, which at Price Group meant that I wrote everything that had Jonathan's name on it. His thought leadership articles for Harvard Business Review and Forbes, his keynote speeches, including the one he gave at a technology conference in San Francisco in my first year, that generated enough response to land him a speaking agent. His client proposals when they needed the kind of language that made a potential client feel that hiring Price Group was not a vendor decision, but a strategic transformation. His LinkedIn posts, which he dictated to me in voice memos from his car, and which I turned into the kind of incisive 3-paragraph professional observations that generated thousands of engagements, and had grown his following from 12,000 to nearly 80,000 in the 3 years I had been doing it. Jonathan knew I was good at this. He told me regularly, in the direct, unsentimental way he told people things, which was one of the qualities I had genuinely admired about him in the early years, that I had the ability to find the center of an idea and build outward from it, in a way that most communications professionals could not. He told me I made him sound smarter than he was, which was both a compliment and not entirely true, because Jonathan was genuinely intelligent, and the work I did was not about manufacturing intelligence, but about finding the clearest possible expression for intelligence that already existed but had not yet found its form. I told him once that I thought of my job as translation rather than creation, and he had said that was exactly right, and that it was why he was glad he had hired me. The book conversation began in April of the year before the launch. Jonathan had been approached by a business press imprint called Alderton Books, whose senior editor, a woman named Caroline Marsh, had seen his San Francisco keynote and thought the framework he had described in it, the decision-making structure he called Clarity First Leadership, was expandable into a full book and potentially a significant one. She had reached out to him directly, he had met with her, and she had offered him a contract with an advance that I knew the amount of because I had written the email to his agent confirming the terms. He came to me the day after he signed the contract and told me he wanted me to write it. Not help him write it. Write it. He said he did not have the time or the inclination to produce a manuscript himself, and that my understanding of how he thought was thorough enough that I could produce something authentic, and that this was how most business books by executives at his level worked, and that it was a legitimate arrangement that the industry had normalized, and that he would compensate me fairly for the additional work. I want to be honest about my response to that conversation because I think the honesty matters. I said yes. Not immediately, not without thinking about it, but I said yes. And I said yes knowing what I was agreeing to, which was that I would write a book that would be published under someone else's name. I had two reasons for saying yes, and one of them was practical, and one of them was something I am less comfortable describing. The practical reason was that Jonathan had offered me a flat fee of $35,000 for the manuscript on top of my salary, and $35,000 was a significant sum of money for someone at my salary level, and would cover the student loans from the communications degree that I had been paying down at a pace that felt geological. The less comfortable reason was that I believed, genuinely, that the arrangement was the thing Jonathan had said it was, a normal professional arrangement that the industry had normalized, and that the work would be the thing it had always been, which was his thinking in my language, and that the distinction between those two things was the distinction between his name on the cover and the reality of where the sentences had come from, and that this was a distinction I could live with. I spent 8 months writing the Clarity Principle. I want to describe what those 8 months actually required, because I think people imagine ghostwriting as transcription, and it is not transcription. Jonathan and I met every Tuesday afternoon for 90 minutes, and in those meetings I asked him questions that I had prepared specifically to draw out the content for whatever chapter I was working on, the way a skilled interviewer asks questions that produce the answer they need without the subject knowing the answer was being aimed for. He talked. I listened and took notes. After the meetings, I went home and I spent 3 to 4 hours converting what he had said into a chapter that felt like it had been written by a person with a coherent voice and a clear argument and a sense of how to build from a specific observation to a general principle, which was the whole of what the job required, and which was also, I understood as I was doing it, considerably more difficult than I had expected. The manuscript went through 3 rounds of revisions with Caroline at Alderton, and every communication with Caroline went through me because Jonathan had said from the beginning that I should manage the editorial relationship, and that he would review whatever I decided to send. I sent drafts from my work email. Caroline responded to me. I incorporated her feedback and sent revised drafts. In the course of 8 months, I exchanged 114 emails with Caroline Marsh about the manuscript, and every one of those emails was in my sent folder, and every one of Caroline's responses was in my inbox. And the entire record of the manuscript's development from first draft through final copy-edited version existed in that email thread under my name. I had not thought about what that record meant until the launch party. Jonathan's fee to me had been paid in 2 installments, $17,500 at the start, and the remaining $17,500 due at delivery of the final manuscript. The first installment had been paid on time. The second installment had not been paid. When I had asked about it in January, 3 months before the launch, Jonathan had said the firm's cash flow was temporarily compressed due to a large project, and that he would clear it within 60 days. When 60 days passed and I asked again, he said he was dealing with an unexpected client situation and that it would be resolved before the launch. When I followed up 2 weeks before the launch, he said he had every intention of honoring the agreement and that I should trust him on the timing. I had trusted him. I had trusted him the way I had trusted most things about our professional relationship, which was more than was warranted by the evidence, and less than would have been rational if I had been examining the evidence with the same clarity I applied to other people's situations rather than my own. The launch party was on a Thursday evening in October. I had been invited as a member of the Price Group leadership team, which was the category in which I would be introduced to anyone who asked, and which was accurate and also a complete description of my relationship to the book from the outside, while being an almost total misdescription from the inside. I wore a dress I had bought the previous spring for a different occasion and had not worn yet. I took a cab to the Chicago Athletic Association because I had decided I did not want to deal with parking in the emotional state I was in, which was a state I had not fully named yet, but that had been building since the second missed payment and had reached something close to a defined shape in the previous 2 weeks. The room was full in the way that book launch parties for business books are full, a specific mixture of the author's professional network, the publisher's contacts, media people, and enthusiastic clients who have been told that attending is a sign of their relationship to the brand. I knew perhaps 30 of the 200 people present, and I moved through the room doing the thing I had learned to do at professional events over 4 years of doing this work, which was to be present and pleasant, and to give no indication of the interior state that was running underneath the surface of every conversation. Jonathan gave his remarks at 8 o'clock. He stood at the podium with the confidence of someone who has given 1,000 speeches, which he had, and he described the book's origins in the way the book's introduction described them, which I had written, and he thanked Caroline from Alderton Books and his agent and his team at Price Group, and he said the names of 3 colleagues who had provided feedback on early drafts, and he thanked his wife, and he said that the book was the distillation of everything he had learned in 15 years of doing this work, and that he hoped it would be useful to the people in the room, and to the people who would read it. He did not say my name. I had not expected him to say my name. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters for understanding what kind of surprise the phone call was. I had understood from the beginning of the arrangement that my name would not be on the book, and I had understood when I accepted the invitation to the launch party that my name would not be said in the remarks, and I had stood in that atrium nursing my sparkling water with the specific combination of professional composure and interior complexity that had been my primary mode of existence for 8 months, and I had watched Jonathan receive applause for the clarity principle, and I had felt the particular thing you feel when you have agreed to be invisible and are then actually invisible, and find that the experience of it is different from the anticipation of it. My phone buzzed at 8:23, while Jonathan was still at the podium taking questions from the audience. I looked at the screen. The number was a New York area code I did not recognize. I stepped toward the edge of the atrium where it was quieter and I answered. The person on the other end was a man named Gregory Chen, who identified himself as the production director at Alderton Books, and he said he was calling because there was a question about the manuscript metadata that had come up in the final archival process, and he needed to confirm the primary author's legal name for the Library of Congress registration record. He said the manuscript file showed the document author as Adaeze Nwosu, and the byline was Jonathan Price, and he wanted to confirm which name should be registered as the primary author for copyright purposes. I stood at the edge of the atrium while Jonathan Price answered an audience question about the book's relevance to mid-market companies, and I thought about what Gregory Chen had just asked me. The manuscript file showed the document author as Adaeze Nwosu because I had written the manuscript in Microsoft Word on my personal laptop, and the document properties recorded the user account under which the file was created, which was mine, and every draft I had sent to Caroline had been sent from my email address and had retained those document properties, and the Library of Congress copyright registration was a legal record that existed independently of whose name was on the cover, and what Gregory Chen was telling me, without understanding that he was telling me anything beyond a routine administrative question, was that there was a legal record of authorship that said my name. I told Gregory Chen that the manuscript had been written by me under a work-for-hire arrangement, and that the copyright registration should reflect Jonathan Price as the author of record per the publishing contract, and that if there was any question about the arrangement, he should speak with Alderton's legal team and Jonathan's agent. He said he understood and thanked me, and ended the call. I stood at the edge of the atrium for a long time. The applause at the podium had ended, and the room had moved into the open conversation portion of the evening, and people were moving around me with glasses and small plates from the catering station, and I stood there doing the calculation that I had been partially doing for 2 months and had not finished. The second payment had not come. The book had launched. The copyright registration had my name in the document metadata. I had 114 emails with the publisher's editor documenting every stage of the manuscript's development. I had the original agreement with Jonathan, which I had been careful enough, even in the early optimistic stage of the arrangement, to have in writing, which was a habit Justine, my lawyer friend, had drilled into me years earlier when I had described a previous professional situation that had gone sideways partly because nothing had been written down. The written agreement said flat fee of $35,000 for manuscript services, deliverable defined as complete manuscript meeting publisher specifications, payment in 2 installments. It did not say ghostwriting. It said manuscript services, which was the term Jonathan had used and which I had accepted without examining why he had phrased it that way, and which I was now examining with the particular thoroughness of someone who has just spoken to a production director and understood that the document metadata said her name. Jonathan found me at 9 o'clock, 40 minutes after the phone call, when the party had moved into a looser social phase and he was circulating through the room with the specific warm momentum of someone who has just had a professional success and is in the best version of his public self. He shook hands with someone to his left and then turned and saw me and came over with the expression of a man who is pleased with his evening and expects everyone around him to share the pleasure. He said the event had gone well. I agreed that it had. He said Caroline was delighted with the early pre-order numbers. I said I had heard that. He said he would get the remaining payment sorted by end of the month and that he appreciated my patience. I said I appreciated that and that I had a question about the copyright registration for the manuscript. His expression shifted by approximately the amount that expressions shift when someone has heard a word they were not expecting in a context that makes the word significant. I told him about Gregory Chen's call. I told him calmly, in the way I told him everything, which was precisely and without the emotional register that would give him something to respond to, other than the information itself. I told him the document metadata showed my name and that Gregory had called to clarify the copyright record. I told him I had told Gregory to refer to the publishing contract and the agent. Then I said that the situation made me want to clarify a few things before the end of the month, specifically what the written agreement between us covered and whether the manuscript services agreement gave him the rights he needed for the copyright registration to proceed as intended. Jonathan looked at me for a moment. He was a smart man, and he processed information quickly, and I could see him processing. He said the agreement was a standard work-for-hire arrangement, and that work-for-hire transferred copyright to the commissioning party. I said I understood that, and that I wanted to make sure the agreement was specific enough to satisfy the publisher's legal team if the document metadata question was escalated, and that if there was any ambiguity in the agreement's language, it might be better to resolve it before the copyright record was finalized, rather than after. What I was doing, and I want to be honest about this because I think the honesty matters, was not threatening him. I was telling him the truth about the situation while making clear that I understood the situation, and those two things together had the effect of a threat without being one, which is a distinction that mattered to me because I had not come to the launch party to make a scene, and I was not going to make a scene. What I had come to understand, standing at the edge of the atrium 40 minutes earlier, was that I had documentation that was significant, and that the conversation about the second payment needed to happen in the context of my understanding that I had documentation, not as a separate conversation where I was simply waiting for a check. Jonathan said he would have his legal counsel review the agreement and that he would be in touch in the morning. He said it without the warmth he had been carrying through the room all evening, in the clipped register he used when he was dealing with something he wanted to move past quickly. I said that sounded fine. We both moved in separate directions through the party, and I stayed another 20 minutes and said goodbye to the colleagues I knew, and took a cab home and called Justine from the back seat. Justine asked me how I was. I said I was functioning. She said that was a specific kind of answer. I told her about the phone call and the conversation with Jonathan. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the voice she uses when she is organizing a situation professionally rather than emotionally, that what I had described was a set of circumstances where the documentation I held was more significant than I had previously understood, and that I should not communicate with Jonathan again about any of it without her in the loop. I said I understood. She said she would call me in the morning. What followed was 6 weeks that I am going to describe, with less detail than the events before the launch party, because some of it is still in a professional context that requires discretion, and because the 6 weeks were primarily a legal and administrative process rather than a narrative, and the narrative was already complete in the atrium of the Chicago Athletic Association. At the moment, I understood what Gregory Chen's call meant. The short version is this. Justine reviewed the manuscript services agreement and found what she described as language that was insufficiently specific to constitute a clean work-for-hire transfer under copyright law as it applied to literary works, which meant that the copyright position was more complicated than Jonathan had represented, and that the complication was one he needed to resolve before Alderton's legal team did their own review and reached the same conclusion independently. She also noted that the 114 emails constituted a documented record of authorship involvement that was difficult to reconcile with a straightforward work-for-hire framing. Jonathan's attorney contacted Justine within 4 days of my conversation with Jonathan at the party, which told me that the conversation had landed the way I had intended it to. There were 3 weeks of communication between the attorneys during which I did not contact Jonathan directly, and he did not contact me, and during which I continued doing my job at Price Group with the specific professional composure that I had been practicing in one form or another for most of my adult life. The resolution had 3 components. The outstanding $1,700 was paid within the first week of the attorney communication, which told me that the withholding had been strategic rather than financial, which I had suspected, and which the speed of payment confirmed. The manuscript services agreement was amended with language that Justine considered sufficient for the copyright registration to proceed as Jonathan needed it to. And the published book's second printing, which Alderton had already scheduled given the pre-order numbers, would include an acknowledgments page revision that described me as the primary writer of the manuscript, which was a different category of acknowledgement from the standard thanks that appears in most ghostwritten business books, and which had been, per Justine, one of the negotiated terms. I left Price Group in December, 2 months after the launch party. Not because the resolution had failed. It had not failed, but because I had spent the 6 weeks of the attorney process understanding something that the launch party had surfaced, but that had been true for longer than one evening. I had been doing work that was significant, and doing it in a structure that was designed to make the significance invisible, and I had agreed to that structure, and had then found that the agreement was not being honored even on its own terms. And once you have found that, the question is not whether to renegotiate the terms, but whether the structure itself is what you want to be inside. I had been writing other people's words for 4 years, and I was very good at it, and it had taught me a great deal about how ideas become language and how language shapes the way people understand ideas. And what I understood by December was that those 4 years had produced a skill set that was fully mine, and that I was going to take it somewhere that did not require it to be invisible. I started Nwosu Communications in January, a boutique firm doing executive communications and content strategy. I did not take any Price Group clients with me, because the professional ethics of that mattered to me, and I was not going to compromise them for a shorter ramp-up period. I built from referrals, the way I had always built things, starting with people who had seen my work even when my work had someone else's name on it, which is the particular advantage of being good at what you do in a field where the people who receive the work are paying close enough attention to know where it actually comes from. The acknowledgments page of the Clarity Principle's second printing describes me as the primary writer of the manuscript. Jonathan's author bio still describes him as the book's author, which is the standard arrangement, and which is accurate in the sense that his name is on the cover and his ideas are the content. The two things can both be true simultaneously, and the publishing industry has always understood this, which is why the acknowledgments page exists and why what is on it matters. I have the email thread with Caroline Marsh in a folder on my personal laptop. 114 emails. I do not look at them often. I keep them the way I keep all records of things I have built, not because I expect to need them again, but because the record is how I know, with a certainty that does not depend on anyone else's account, what the work actually was. My mother asked me once, early in my career, what I wanted my professional life to look like in 10 years, and I had said I wanted to be the person in the room who made everyone else's thinking clearer. And she had said that sounded like a very specific kind of invisible and had asked whether I was comfortable with invisible. I had said yes at the time. I had a more complicated answer now. What I understood by the time I left Price Group was that invisible is a condition you accept or decline, and that accepting it has costs that are not always visible until the moment when someone stands at a podium and receives applause for the sentences you wrote at 2 a.m. for 8 months. And you are standing at the edge of the room holding a glass of sparkling water that you have been nursing for 40 minutes, and a man named Gregory Chen calls from a New York area code to ask you which name belongs on the copyright record, and the answer is yours, and has always been yours, and the document metadata knew it the whole time. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the record is always more complete than the people who try to manage it understand. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.